All right, Alexander, we have the meeting between the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, and the American leader, Joe Biden, at the G20. What were the results of this meeting?
None. This is a short answer. It was one of the. I think it was a very. From what I've been able to understand, it was a pretty brief meeting. They did meet one to one. They've not met one to one before. Up to now, all their meetings have been virtual. But the Chinese have provided an astonishingly short readout, and none of it is interesting, and none of it points to any kind of actual concrete agreements about anything. But it does contain again some very interesting phrases. This Chinese readout, and this is Xi Jinping addressing Biden, and the Chinese readout says this: a statesman should think about how and where to lead his country. He should also think about and know how to get along with other countries and the wider world. Now that suggests again Xi Jinping, ever so subtly, as he likes to do, giving a little lecture to Biden. In other words, telling Biden, you've got to learn to get on with people. You've got to learn to think about others, not just yourself all the time. But that's all I could see that came out of this. There was no concrete agreements. There was no actual results out of this meeting. There wasn't even an agreement to meet again or something of that kind, setting up for a proper summit meeting. And at the same time, the big story of the G20 is that there's been this big battle going on within the G20 with the West trying to get various communiques published that criticize Russia. And it seems the Chinese have opposed every one of them, alongside the Russians, obviously. So the result is that the Chinese are fully backing the Russians in every respect.
Why would the United States think otherwise? I mean, it sounds very naive that the U.S. would actually believe that they could, at this moment in time, um, move the Russians towards their way of thinking. The Russians, the Chinese, move the Chinese closer to their way of thinking with regards to Russia and to the whole concept of multipolarity. I mean, why would the Chinese are obviously the lead country, or China and Russia are the lead countries in this, new architecture, whether it's the SCO, the BRICS. Why would the U.S. believe that China would ditch it all? I mean, I do understand that Biden, he came out with various statements and he said after the midterms that he feels like he's received the mandate, he's emboldened by the results, and he's received the mandate to sit down with China and tell them how it is, like really stick it to China and say, look, here's the deal. Here are our red lines. Here's what we want from you. Those were Biden's statements, very tough talking. But we live in a real world. Why would anyone believe that China would ditch everything they've spent all these decades building, in order to do what? To become part of the collective West? I mean, architecture
Well, quite.
doesn't
Well,
make much
quite.
sense.
Well, quite. I mean, again, I can't help but think that this is just another one of those meetings that's now taking place between the Chinese and the Americans, the president of America and the president of China, which have no real purpose any longer other than to gradually clarify the fact that these two countries are going in completely different directions. Because that's essentially what they're doing. There is no way that the US is going to get China to change its position, and there's no way in which the Chinese expect the US to change its position on anything either. So they meet, they talk past each other increasingly, and they each then go back to their respective countries and they make their respective preparations. And in China's case, there's a big move now towards self-sufficiency. They're building up their microprocessor production. They're building up their nuclear weapon systems. They're developing their alliance with the Russians. They're developing their armed forces. They're clearly preparing for the big clash that's coming. And the Americans meet with them. And as I said, the two sides just talk past each other because that's all they can do.
Okay. What do you make of the reports with Sergei Lavrov that he was sick,
I think it's
that were
just
put out by Reuters?
Yeah, they were. This is the British again
But-
trying to. I mean, I have to say, I mean, as a British person,
And he's okay, by the way. Just want to
absolutely,
preface.
I know.
Yeah, he even made a statement saying that this is once again par for the course with the
Yes.
with the collective West media. But I just want to say he's okay. He wasn't sick, but the reports were out there.
Absolutely, this is a good example of the British again behaving like. I mean, I have to say, spoiled children, trying to sort of needle the Russians all the time. You know, blow peas at the Russian bear. It's just silly. I mean, I find this kind of thing utterly offensive. Actually, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It shows that we're not any longer a serious country when we put out stories like that about the foreign minister of Russia, which is self-evidently and obviously untrue. I don't know what it was intended to achieve. It was intended to make people think, you know, that Lavrov had some kind of a nervous breakdown because, you know, he wasn't able to speak to Blinken of all people, presumably, or Biden or whatever, or whether, you know, he's. I mean, I really am at a loss to understand what it was achieved. But Reuters, remember, is a British news agency. It's getting this information undoubtedly from British government sources. It relays them. And as I said, it's just childish. I'm going to say something briefly about the G20 altogether, by the way, which is, in my opinion, the G20 is now on the brink of total collapse as an institution. What we see is that there's one group of countries who are the G7, who are going their way. And then there's another group of countries, China, Russia, to a great extent India, Brazil as well, Saudi Arabia, and they're all going a completely different way. And you have this very unfortunate and rather sad, but rather impressive person, the president of Indonesia, trying to do everything he possibly can to keep this thing together, to get some kind of communiques together, to get people to at least stand together in a group photograph. And he's finding it impossible because the Western powers won't accept that. They're pushing all the time to try to exclude the others. I mean, they've gone after the Russians this time, but they can't exclude the Chinese. But anyway, they're trying to do that as well. And the overall impression is that the Russians, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Saudis, the Indians, they're just shrugging their shoulders, doing their own thing in another part of the room, basically. So the G20, which began in 1999, I seem to remember, by the way, that it was Tony Blair's and Bill Clinton's initiative, is now on its last legs. I mean, it's in this new world where we have divisions between the great powers, it really has no future.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think we're seeing the last days of the G20 and the G7 is just a club of the collective West anyway. So no one really cares about that anymore. That's just for collective West consumption. But it's the rise of the BRICS.
It's the rise of the BRICS.
The rise of the BRICS, the end of the G20, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I would say about the G20 meeting is that Japan has, for the first time, sort of followed a semi-independent course. They seem to be more willing to talk to the Russians, though they're not doing so in public. And, of course, they're continuing to buy oil and LNG from the Russians. And it seems that the Chinese and the Japanese are having some kind of discussions with each other at the G20 as well. So I'm not saying that Japan is about to detach itself from the West. Quite the contrary. I absolutely don't. But it has provided, if you like, a venue. The G20, this particular G20 summit has provided the Japanese with a venue to just speak to a few people independently of, Washington's dictates.
Yeah, and I read reports that Biden is not planning to meet with Saudi Arabia either,
No,
which
no,
is that's a bad sign right there. Really
no,
bad sign. I mean,
no.
the U.S. is losing Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
I'm not saying they've lost them, but they're losing Saudi Arabia, and they're definitely losing Turkey as well. I'm not saying that they've lost them. I'm not saying that, but the U.S. better take note because these countries are getting to the point where they're not going to look back. They're gonna go straight towards the new guys.
absolutely. The rising sun in place of the setting sun.
Okay, we will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are also on Rockfin and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.